When Michael told me he wanted a divorce, he did it the way he did everything else, with a sense of calm control that suggested he'd already planned every detail. We were in the living room of our glass-walled penthouse overlooking the city skyline, a view he always said represented his success. He poured himself a drink, sat back, and said it so casually that for a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "I think it's time we went our separate ways, Claire." There was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation. He didn't reach for my hand, didn't even look up from the amber liquid in his glass. After 11 years of marriage, he ended it as if he were canceling a dinner reservation. I stood there, speechless, staring at him, waiting for some explanation. When he finally met my eyes, I saw nothing. Not anger, not guilt, just calculation. That's when I knew this wasn't sudden. He'd planned it. And if he'd planned it, it meant he thought he could control how it ended. I didn't say a word. Not then. I just nodded, turned, and walked to the bedroom. My body moved on autopilot, but my mind was already racing. Michael was a corporate strategist, ruthless, brilliant, and utterly without conscience. If he wanted a divorce, it wasn't because he'd fallen out of love. It was because he'd found a way to benefit from it. That night, I lay awake beside him while he slept soundly, as if nothing had changed. I studied the rise and fall of his chest and thought about all the late nights he claimed were business meetings. The phone calls he'd take in the next room. The sudden secrecy around his laptop. My gut told me there was another woman, but my instincts said there was more. Much more. The next morning, I called my lawyer, not to start divorce proceedings, but to make inquiries. Quiet ones. I wanted to know exactly how much of our wealth was truly ours, and how much was buried behind the layers of shell companies and overseas accounts Michael had always said were for tax efficiency. 3 days later, I met with a discreet forensic accountant recommended by my lawyer. Her name was Naomi, calm, sharp-eyed, and utterly unflappable. She listened without interrupting as I explained the situation. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "If he's hiding something, we'll find it. But you'll need to be patient." Patience was something I had learned well in my marriage. Over the next several weeks, I played the role of the composed, soon-to-be ex-wife. I attended charity galas, smiled for photographs, and even held Michael's arm in public. Inside, I was studying him, the subtle changes in his schedule, the extra security on his office computer, the cryptic calls from consultants. He was covering his tracks, but I'd already planted the first seeds of my own game. Naomi's findings started trickling in. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, undisclosed assets, and transactions routed through dummy corporations, all tied back to Michael. But that wasn't the shocking part. What stunned me was where the money was going. Some of it was funneled through a company connected to an ongoing government defense contract, one that Michael's firm had no business touching. If those transfers were exposed, it wouldn't just ruin him. It could lead to an investigation that would end careers and maybe even send people to prison. I realized then that this wasn't just about infidelity or greed. Michael wasn't just trying to protect his wealth. He was trying to erase me from the equation before anyone found out how dirty that money was. I started recording everything. Every conversation, every suspicious document I could access, every offhand comment. When he left his laptop open one morning, I copied an entire folder of encrypted files onto a hidden drive. I didn't even understand half of what I was looking at, but Naomi did. Her messages grew increasingly urgent. "Claire," she said one evening, "your husband isn't just laundering money. He's involved in procurement fraud, falsifying records for defense contracts. If this leaks, it's not just financial. It's criminal." I remember the silence that followed. The city lights flickered outside my window, and the weight of what I held in my hands pressed down on me. I could destroy him utterly, but doing it wrong could drag me down too. So I waited. I smiled through dinner parties, let him believe he was still in control. He was careful now, watching me, probably thinking he'd broken me. He underestimated how quiet revenge can look. When the official divorce papers arrived, they were brutal. He wanted the penthouse, the investments, even control of the foundation I'd built in my name, the one cause that truly mattered to me. His lawyers called it a fair division. My own lawyer called it theft. But I didn't fight it. Not yet. I signed the acknowledgement of receipt and let him think I was done resisting. Inside, I was planning my endgame. 2 weeks later, I scheduled a lunch with one of Michael's closest business rivals, a man named David Chin, who had been trying to undercut him for years. Michael despised him, which made him perfect. I didn't hand David anything illegal, of course. But I hinted, just enough to make him curious. A few offhand remarks about discrepancies in Michael's contracts, about money trails that didn't match. David's curiosity was predictable. Within days, whispers began circulating through the boardrooms. Michael's company stock started to wobble. Investors got nervous. I watched from the sidelines as rumors spread faster than truth. And all the while, I stayed quiet, patient, invisible. Then came the night everything cracked open. Michael came home late, agitated, his tie loose, his expression tight. "You've been talking," he said, voice low, dangerous. "Talking?" I asked, feigning confusion. "Don't play dumb, Claire. Someone's been leaking details. The board's panicking. Do you know how much this could cost us?" Us. The word made me laugh. He slammed his drink onto the counter, the glass shattering. "Don't push me," he warned. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "You already did." For the first time, I saw fear in his face. Not guilt. Fear. That night, I knew the balance had shifted. Naomi called the next morning. "The files you copied, they're enough to open a federal case if the right people see them." She paused. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I stared out at the city, sunlight reflecting off the skyscrapers that had once symbolized Michael's power. "Yes," I said softly. "But I want him to see it coming." Over the next week, I orchestrated the quiet unraveling of everything he'd built. Anonymous tips to investigative journalists. A few strategically leaked documents to regulators. Subtle nudges that connected the dots between his offshore accounts and fraudulent contracts. By the time the federal auditors arrived, the trap was already set. Michael was at a business conference in Geneva when it happened. I imagined the look on his face when his assistant handed him the news, his company offices raided, accounts frozen, an emergency board meeting called. The empire he'd built on deception collapsed in 48 hours. When he finally called me, his voice was different. Strained. Desperate. "Claire, what did you do?" I took a slow breath. You wanted a divorce, Michael. I just gave you one worth remembering. There was silence on the line, the kind that tastes like finality. He didn't know the half of it yet. The silence after that call lasted almost a full minute, though it felt longer. I could picture him standing in his hotel suite, surrounded by luxury and panic, his perfect composure cracking in ways his board had probably never seen. When he finally spoke, the smooth confidence was gone. You have no idea what you've done, Claire. You think this hurts me? You're in this too. Everything we built was together. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. You made sure my name was never on anything important, remember? You wanted the control. You can keep it. He exhaled hard, like someone realizing too late that the chessboard had been rigged from the start. They'll come after you, too. You think they won't? You were part of this marriage. Your name's attached to half of what I own. That's the difference, I said softly. You owned it. I just lived in it. I ended the call. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of it all sink in. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Years of silence, of watching him manipulate and dominate every conversation, every financial move, every friend. And now, the man who thought he was untouchable was finally unraveling. The following morning, my lawyer called. Claire, are you watching the news? I turned on the TV. Every major business network was running the same headline: Federal inquiry launched into Hawthorne Strategic Holdings. Michael's photo was everywhere, walking briskly through an airport, face hard and jaw set, refusing to answer reporters' questions. His empire had been built on clean numbers and public trust, and both were disintegrating in real time. My lawyer's tone was cautious. Claire, this could get messy. If he tries to claim you were complicit, we'll need to show you cooperated with investigators. I already have, I said. They just don't know it yet. The next few days blurred into one another. Investigators started showing up at our penthouse with warrants. I answered their questions politely, provided documents, copies of the same files I'd already leaked through anonymous channels. Every answer I gave painted a clear picture. I was the wife who discovered her husband's crimes too late, horrified and willing to help make it right. Michael, meanwhile, went silent. His company issued sterile statements about full cooperation and temporary administrative leave. But within a week, he was suspended. Then came the subpoenas. I didn't hear from him again until he returned to the city under pressure from his legal team. He showed up unannounced. I opened the door and there he was, disheveled, eyes bloodshot, expensive suit creased from travel. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look small. Claire, he said quietly, stepping inside before I could answer. They're tearing me apart. They've frozen everything. The accounts, the properties. I need your help. I laughed before I could stop myself. My help? You have to tell them I didn't what? I cut him off. Didn't lie. Didn't funnel millions through dummy corporations. Didn't try to erase me from every financial record so you could walk away with everything. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the living room. You don't understand. This wasn't supposed to go this far. It was just strategy. Everyone does it. I just got caught. I finished for him. He stopped pacing, looking at me like he was seeing a stranger. You did this. Of course I did, I said. My voice was calm, even. You handed me the matches years ago. I just waited for the right night to strike. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but then the fight drained out of him. You think this makes you free? You're going down with me. I shook my head slowly. No, Michael. I'm walking away clean. And you're walking into the spotlight you built for yourself. He stormed out without another word, slamming the door so hard the walls shuddered. That night, I received an email from Naomi. Attached was a single-page document labeled simply confirmation. When I opened it, I saw bank statements tracing every illegal transfer, all authenticated, all time-stamped. She'd done it. She built the final piece of the puzzle. I forwarded it to an encrypted inbox belonging to a contact in the Department of Justice. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the city hum outside my window. Revenge didn't feel the way I expected. It wasn't fireworks or satisfaction, it was quiet, heavy, final. A week later, the arrests started. Michael's CFO was taken in first, then one of the lawyers who'd helped set up the shell companies. Michael himself tried to run, chartered a private jet to Zurich, but he didn't make it out of the country. They picked him up at the airport, and the footage of him in handcuffs looped on every channel for 3 days. I thought that would be the end of it. But power never dies quietly. 2 nights after his arrest, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, there was a pause, and then a voice I didn't recognize said, "Mrs. Hawthorne, this is Agent Keating with the Bureau. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your husband's offshore activities." The next morning, I met 2 federal agents in a quiet cafe downtown. They were polite but precise. They asked about the accounts, the transactions, the files I'd turned over. Then one of them leaned forward and asked, "How did you get access to these documents?" "I found them," I said carefully. He left his computer unlocked. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're very fortunate you came forward when you did." They left shortly after that, but the message was clear. My revenge had consequences, and I'd walked a fine line between justice and criminal liability. Still, I slept better that night than I had in years. A month passed. The investigation widened. Michael's trial became a media circus, and my name inevitably surfaced in the press. The public painted me as either the betrayed wife or the silent accomplice. I didn't care which. My silence had become my shield. When the verdict finally came, I didn't attend the hearing. I just watched the news, a glass of wine in hand, as the anchor announced the sentence, 15 years in federal prison. They showed a clip of him being led out of the courtroom, his expression blank, the same calm he'd once used to control every room. Only now, it looked like defeat. The world called it justice. I called it closure. But the truth was, I wasn't done yet. Even in prison, Michael's reach extended further than most people realized. There were offshore accounts I hadn't touched yet, assets he thought were invisible. I could have taken them immediately, drained them dry, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I waited until the media storm began to fade, until his name stopped trending, until the city forgot him. Then I used what he taught me, the quiet manipulation, the patience, the precision, to move those assets into new accounts under new names. I didn't steal them. I reclaimed them. Every dollar that had once been a tool of his control became my escape. By the time I was done, I'd built something new. A foundation in my own name, real this time, transparent, untainted. The same cause he'd once tried to claim for publicity became my redemption. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself wondering if he thought of me in that concrete cell. If he realized the irony of it all, that the woman he'd tried to erase had outplayed him using his own tactics. I never visited him. I never wrote. The last communication between us was the final court notice confirming the transfer of marital assets. It was stamped, filed, and official. Everything he'd tried to keep from me was now legally mine. The city skyline looked different after that. It wasn't just a view anymore, it was proof. Proof that I'd survived him. I didn't celebrate. There was no need. Revenge, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't explode. It unfolds quietly, precisely, until there's nothing left of the person who thought they held the power. And when it's done, truly done, you don't need applause. You just need peace. It was strange how quickly silence filled the spaces he used to occupy. For weeks after the sentencing, I would still catch myself expecting his voice echoing down the hallway, the sound of his shoes against the marble floor, the faint scent of his cologne clinging to the air. But the apartment had gone still, the way a stage does after the curtain falls. The ghost of him remained in the furniture, the books, the untouched glass decanters on the bar. Yet even that presence began to fade as the noise of the world moved on. The media stopped calling. The investors who had once fawned over us now pretended they'd never known our names. The people who had attended our dinner parties disappeared into their own polished lives, whispering stories they'd never admit to spreading. And for the first time in more than a decade, I was alone. It wasn't emptiness. It was space. I sold the penthouse. It had been his kingdom, his fortress, his mirror. I didn't want its view anymore. I bought a smaller home on the edge of the city, a house surrounded by trees, quiet enough that I could hear the wind through the leaves at night. It didn't overlook anything, it simply existed. That was enough. Months passed. My foundation grew in ways I hadn't expected. People began to trust my name again, not as a scandal, but as something solid. I learned to speak publicly about rebuilding from betrayal, about integrity in business, about truth as its own kind of currency. The irony wasn't lost on me. The skills I had learned from him, the precision, the calculation, the patience, became the tools of my redemption. Then, one morning, I received a letter. It was unmarked except for a prison return address. The handwriting was unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Claire, it began. You've won. Congratulations. I hope it was worth it. I still don't believe you understood what you destroyed, but perhaps that's what makes you dangerous. You always underestimated how much of you was like me. You didn't just want justice. You wanted control. Be careful with it. It will own you the way it owned me. No signature. He didn't need one. I tore the letter in half, then in half again, until the words were unrecognizable. But something about it stayed with me, not the accusation, but the warning. Control. That was the word that had governed our entire marriage. He'd used it to build empires and to cage me. I had used it to dismantle him. And now, even gone, he was still trying to shape how I saw myself. For a moment, I wondered if this was how men like him survived, by planting seeds in other people's minds, by lingering long after their power was stripped away. I refused to let him live rent-free in mine. That evening, I went to the foundation office. The building was modest but bright, filled with people who cared more about integrity than image. We were funding programs for financial transparency, whistleblower protection, and corporate accountability. The kind of causes that would have made Michael sneer. The irony was my favorite part. Naomi still worked closely with me. She'd become more than an accountant, she was my confidant, my anchor. Over dinner that night, she asked quietly, "Do you ever think he'll come after you again, somehow?" I smiled faintly. He already did. That letter wasn't about reconciliation. It was a test. He wants to know if he still has power over me. Does he? I thought for a long moment. No, I said finally. He taught me too well. 6 months later, I received another message, but this one wasn't from him. It was from a lawyer representing a foreign investment firm. Apparently, some assets had surfaced in a European bank, connected to shell corporations that had once been under Michael's control. The firm wanted to know whether I had any claim to them as his legal spouse at the time of acquisition. I did. The amount was staggering. Hidden reserves of capital that had somehow slipped through federal seizure, buried under a web of anonymous trusts. Michael must have thought they were untouchable. I almost laughed when I read the numbers. He'd left one last piece of his empire unguarded, and it had drifted right back into my orbit. The next day, I flew to Zurich. The bank's glass towers gleamed like knives against the pale winter sky. Inside, everything smelled like polished wood and quiet money. The banker, a silver-haired man with perfect manners, walked me through the verification process. "It's highly unusual," he said. "These accounts were structured to remain dormant for decades. It seems Mr. Hawthorne never expected them to be found." "I imagine he didn't," I replied. When he handed me the paperwork, I signed without hesitation. With each stroke of the pen, I closed another chapter of what he'd built. That night, as I stood on the hotel balcony overlooking the frozen river, I finally let the truth settle in. I hadn't just destroyed his empire. I had inherited it. Not the money itself, that was meaningless, but the power of knowing I could create or dismantle anything he'd once used to control me. For the first time, the thought didn't terrify me. It liberated me. Over the next few years, I used those resources to expand the foundation internationally. We funded journalists, supported investigations, and created scholarships for women entering finance and law. The irony never stopped amusing me. My husband's stolen wealth became the very engine of exposure and accountability. Every now and then, I would read a brief update about him. He'd been transferred to a different facility, filed an appeal, been denied. Once, a photo circulated online, a grainy image of him sitting alone in a prison yard, older, thinner, staring at the ground. I didn't feel pity. Only distance. Time has a way of eroding the sharp edges of revenge. What begins as fury eventually softens into something quieter, understanding, maybe even forgiveness, though not for the person who wronged you. For yourself, for surviving it. I never remarried. I didn't need to. My life became full in other ways: work, travel, friends who knew me as more than an appendage to someone powerful. I discovered how much strength there is in being underestimated, in rebuilding quietly without needing anyone to see the result. Years later, long after Michael's name had faded from the news, I received one final letter. It came from a hospice facility. He was dying. Liver failure. The words were shaky, almost illegible. Claire, I don't expect you to respond. I just want you to know that I see it now. You were never my weakness. You were the mirror I couldn't face. I hope you found peace. I read it once, then folded it carefully and set it in the drawer of my desk. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He died 2 months later. His lawyers contacted me about the estate, what little remained of it. I donated every cent to the foundation. The press called it poetic. I called it closure. Some nights, when I walk through the quiet halls of the foundation, I still think about that first moment, the glass of whiskey in his hand, the calm voice that said, "I think it's time we went our separate ways." He had meant it as an ending. He never realized it was my beginning. Power, I learned, doesn't come from money or control. It comes from knowing the truth and deciding what to do with it. And the truth was simple: he had built an empire on lies, and I had learned to build freedom from their ruins. That was my revenge. Not destroying him, not even surviving him, simply outliving everything he believed defined power. And as I stood in my office one evening, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, I realized I didn't think about him anymore. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with a kind of distant gratitude. He had tried to erase me. Instead, he'd written the story of my becoming. Years passed, as quietly and inevitably as the tide. The world changed, technology reshaped finance, and new names replaced the olden headlines. But one thing never changed: greed had a way of reinventing itself. The same kind of men who once toasted Michael's genius now wore new suits, carried new titles, spoke the same hollow language of innovation and vision. Sometimes I wondered if corruption was simply evolution's way of disguising itself. By then, the foundation had become something far greater than I had ever intended. We had offices in New York, London, and Singapore, networks of investigators, and a growing reputation for bringing down corporate fraud that governments often ignored. We were no longer the quiet moral voice on the sidelines. We were a force that could move markets. I'd been invited to panels, forums, interviews. The woman who redefined accountability, they called me. Every time I heard the phrase, I smiled at the irony. If only they knew where the seed of it all began. One winter morning, I received an encrypted email marked urgent. It was from our European director, a woman named Marin who had once worked in compliance for one of the biggest hedge funds in the world. "Claire," she wrote, "you're going to want to see this." The attachment was a dossier, financial documents, transfer logs, coded transactions. I scanned the names and froze. Among the shell entities, buried deep in the structure, was a familiar one: Hawthorne Global Holdings Limited. I hadn't seen that name in nearly a decade. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. Maybe someone had reused it, unaware of its history. But as I dug deeper, the details grew too specific to ignore. The same offshore network Michael had once used, resurrected under a new registration, managed by a group of former associates he'd known before the collapse. I felt something stir in me, not fear, exactly, but the ghost of an old instinct. By evening, I had a private investigator on the phone. "It's probably a rebrand," he said. "Someone trying to distance the structure from its history." "Or someone trying to reclaim it," I replied. He paused. "That's impossible. He's gone." "Yes," I said softly. "But his systems aren't." The next few weeks blurred into late nights, data trails, encrypted messages, and tense conference calls. The deeper we went, the clearer it became that someone had quietly revived Michael's old empire, not under his name, but using his architecture, his methods, even some of his people. The scale of it was staggering. Billions moved through accounts across 3 continents, hidden in plain sight. And then came the discovery that stopped me cold. One of the signatories listed on the master account was a man named Liam Hawthorne, Michael's son, from his first marriage. I hadn't seen him since he was a boy, sullen, clever, always watching his father with the kind of wary fascination that children reserve for dangerous gods. He'd grown up in boarding schools and European circles, untouched by the scandal that destroyed his father. Apparently, he had learned well. Marin called me one night. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "This is technically your domain, but if you expose him, it'll link back to the Hawthorne name again. You'll be dragged into it." I looked out at the city from my office window, the skyline gleaming like a circuit board. "Then we do it quietly," I said. "The same way I took his father down." We began to trace the flow of money through subsidiaries, real estate, crypto transfers. Every move they made, we mirrored with silent precision. Liam was good, disciplined, patient, almost invisible. But he was still his father's son, and that meant somewhere deep down, he believed himself untouchable. It took 6 months to dismantle him. 6 months of anonymous tips, leaked reports, coordinated audits, and quiet whispers to the right journalists. When the story finally broke, it landed like a thunderclap. "Second-generation scandal," the headlines read. "The ghost of Hawthorne returns." Liam's empire collapsed overnight. Accounts frozen, properties seized, investors fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. He released a statement denying everything, but it didn't matter. The world had already decided. I watched it unfold from my office, my expression unreadable. Marin stood beside me, silent for a long time. "You could have reached out to him," she said finally. "You could have warned him, or helped him." "I could have," I said. "But I didn't build my life on saving men from their fathers." The truth was, it wasn't revenge anymore. It was correction, a cycle closing. For all the years I'd spent escaping Michael's shadow, it seemed I'd finally stepped into the light not by running from it, but by ending what remained of it. After the scandal, I took a sabbatical. 6 months away from the foundation, from the press, from the noise. I spent the time in a small coastal town in southern Italy, a place where no one cared who I was. I rented a house with peeling paint and a garden overgrown with lemon trees. I spent mornings walking by the sea, evenings reading until the sun dipped below the water. For the first time in my life, the silence wasn't heavy. It was healing. One evening, while walking through the narrow streets, I passed a cafe where an old song played through the radio, one Michael used to hum absently while he worked. The sound stopped me in my tracks. For a moment, I felt the echo of my old life brush against me, soft as smoke. Then it faded, leaving nothing but the rhythm of waves in the distance. People think revenge ends when the other person falls. It doesn't. It ends when their name stops meaning anything at all. When you can hear a song, see a face, read a headline, and feel nothing but the steady beat of your own life continuing. By the time I returned to the city, the foundation was thriving without me. I handed more power to my team, stepped back from the daily battles. I started teaching occasionally, lectures about ethics, finance, and the psychology of corruption. My students listened intently, scribbling notes, unaware that every story I told had once been my own. Sometimes they'd ask, "Do you believe people can change?" And I'd answer truthfully, yes. But not until they lose everything they thought made them powerful. Years later, as I sat by the window of my home, watching the first snowfall of winter, I realized I had finally stopped waiting for the past to echo back. There was only the quiet, the peace I'd built, and the faint scent of lemon trees I'd brought back from Italy. The empire was gone. The ghosts were gone. All that remained was the woman who had learned to turn betrayal into purpose. And for the first time, that was enough. Years passed with the kind of stillness that only comes after chaos. The foundation became self-sustaining, a living organism of ethics and ambition that no longer needed my hand guiding it. I stepped away gradually, like someone leaving a room quietly so as not to disturb what's working perfectly without them. I moved to the countryside, an hour outside the city, where the nights were darker, the air sharper, and the world smaller in all the right ways. At first, I thought I would miss it, the rush, the strategy, the taste of victory. But I didn't. I found comfort in anonymity, in the rhythm of simple days. I read again, painted a little, cooked my own meals. I even began writing, not for publication, just for myself. Notes, memories, pieces of a life I had spent too long reacting to. It was in those pages that I began to see the pattern I'd never acknowledged before. Every decision I had made since the day Michael said the word divorce had been a response. Brilliant, calculated, necessary, but still a reaction. Even the foundation, as noble as it was, had been born from the ashes of anger. I had built an empire out of correction, not creation. That realization didn't sadden me. It clarified me. One afternoon, a journalist reached out. Her name was Sienna Brooks, an investigative reporter who had written extensively about corporate corruption. She said she was preparing a book about the hidden human cost of financial power and wanted to include my story, not the scandal, but the recovery. She promised sensitivity. I had refused dozens of interviews over the years, but something in her tone felt different. She didn't sound hungry for gossip. She sounded curious about the person I had become. We met in a quiet cafe, tucked away on a street lined with ivy. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed and careful with her words. "I know you've spoken before about integrity in finance," she began, "but you've never shared what it cost you personally. Would you consider going on record?" I stirred my coffee, watching the swirl of cream fade into the black. "You mean the revenge?" She hesitated. "I mean the survival." I smiled faintly. "They're the same thing." We talked for hours. I told her things I'd never said aloud, the fear, the loneliness, the way revenge begins as a weapon and ends as a mirror. She listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When we finished, She looked almost uncertain. "Do you want me to tell the whole story?" she asked. I thought about it for a long time. The truth had always been both my sword and my shield. It had freed me, but it had also chained me to the past. To tell everything would mean reliving it, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the final act of power wasn't destroying the story, but owning it completely. "Tell it," I said. "But tell it right. I don't want to be a villain or a saint. Just human." She nodded, eyes bright with the kind of understanding that comes from listening to something that changes you. The book took 2 years to write. I read the proofs before publication. She had been true to her word. It wasn't a tale of vengeance, but of reclamation. She titled it "The Truth He Built Me On." The words stopped me cold. It was exactly right. When the book came out, it caused a small storm. People revisited the old headlines, debated ethics and justice and morality. Some called me ruthless, others called me brave. None of it mattered. What mattered was that I no longer felt like a secret. I had lived too long in the shadow of what others did to me. Now, the story was mine, told in my own voice. Months later, Sienna visited me again. "You know," she said, "you could have chosen to stay silent forever. Most people would have. Why tell it now?" I looked out at the garden, where the first snow was melting into soft puddles of earth. "Because power doesn't disappear," I said. "It just changes hands." I wanted to make sure mine ended somewhere honest. After the book, invitations flooded in: conferences, talk shows, panels about ethics and justice. I declined them all. I didn't need the spotlight anymore. I had already said what needed to be said. The world moved on, as it always does. The foundation continued its work under new leadership. Occasionally I would get updates, cases they'd helped expose, lives they'd changed. I was proud, but from a distance. I had built something that no longer needed me. That was the greatest victory of all. One morning, while sorting through old files, I found a small black box I didn't recognize. Inside was a flash drive labeled HGH Archive 1. My initials during the marriage, Hawthorne Global Holdings. It must have been buried in storage for years. I plugged it into my laptop. The drive contained hundreds of old documents, contracts, emails, transaction logs. The ghosts of Michael's empire. But buried among them was something else, a folder marked private. Inside were recordings, not of him, but of me. Conversations from our early years. My voice, young and uncertain, trying to reason with him. Trying to love him. I listened to one. "Michael, this isn't who we are." His voice, smooth and amused, "It's exactly who we are, Claire. You just don't see it yet." I shut the laptop. For a long time, I sat in silence. Then I deleted everything. Every file, every echo, every trace. For years, I had believed evidence was power. That it was the only thing standing between me and destruction. But now, I understood that true power was the ability to let go without fear. That night, I walked out into the cold air, the stars sharp and clear above me. The city lights were far away, dim and distant. Somewhere below the horizon, the ruins of the life I'd once lived still existed in records and memories. But they didn't belong to me anymore. In the quiet, I felt something rare, peace that didn't demand victory. And for the first time in my life, I understood what freedom really meant. Not revenge. Not justice. Not even survival. Just the quiet certainty that I had faced everything, lost everything, and still become someone entirely my own. The years folded in on themselves like pages in a book I'd read too many times to count. I grew older, and time, for once, felt gentle. My hair turned silver, my hands slower, my reflection softer around the edges. The world outside moved faster than I could keep up with markets, headlines, scandals, but I had long since stopped trying to chase it. I had spent a lifetime learning how to control everything. Now, I was learning the beauty of letting things be. The house by the trees had become my sanctuary. It was filled with little pieces of my life, framed photographs from places I'd traveled, a few awards I hadn't asked for, stacks of old notebooks filled with thoughts I'd never shown anyone. Some mornings, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the light shift through the branches, thinking about how strange it was to survive so many versions of yourself. Sometimes I wondered what Michael would think if he could see me now. Not the woman who fought him, or even the one who defeated him, but the one who lived past the need to. He had once told me that power was the only truth that mattered. I had believed him for a long time. Now, I knew better. Power was fleeting. Character was what endured. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived from the foundation. They were organizing a mentorship program for young women in finance, students who wanted to navigate an industry still riddled with shadows. The board wanted me to be part of it, not as a figurehead, but as a mentor. At first, I hesitated. My instincts had always told me to stay behind the curtain. But something about it stirred me. Maybe it was time to pass on what I'd learned, not the tactics, but the understanding of what power could do, both to others and to yourself. A few weeks later, I walked into the Foundation's new headquarters for the first time in years. The building was bright, open, alive. The people there barely knew me except as a name on the wall, a founder, a legacy. It was humbling in a way I hadn't expected. That day, I met a young woman named Avery. She couldn't have been more than 24, sharp-minded but cautious, the kind of intelligence that hides itself out of fear of being underestimated. She reminded me of myself at that age, ambitious, but not yet hardened by betrayal. After our first session, she lingered by the door. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Do you ever regret what you did? Exposing him the way you did?" I thought about it carefully. Regret? I repeated. No. But I've learned that revenge isn't as satisfying as people think it will be. It doesn't erase what was done to you, it just changes who has the control. For a while, that feels like justice. But eventually, you have to ask yourself what you want besides control. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. "And what did you want?" I smiled. "Peace." It took me half a lifetime to realize that's what I was really after. After that, Avery became my shadow in the best way. She asked questions, challenged ideas, saw through pretense. I watched her find her voice, sharper and braver each time she spoke. She reminded me that change was a generational effort, that maybe all my years of fighting were worth it if they made room for women like her to walk without fear. As months passed, I visited the foundation often. My presence became less symbolic, more personal. I told stories, not about revenge or loss, but about resilience, ethics, and the quiet victories no one writes about. People listen differently now, not out of fascination, but respect. One evening, after a long day of mentorship sessions, I stayed behind in the empty conference room. The city lights blinked through the glass walls like 1,000 unspoken memories. I stood there for a while, tracing the reflection of my older self in the window. The woman who looked back wasn't the same one who had once trembled in the shadow of a man's ambition. She was steady, sure, whole. I thought about the empire Michael built, the lies that sustained it, and the ruins that had once been my prison. Then I thought about this room, this foundation, these women. The contrast was almost poetic. Out of corruption had come clarity. Out of betrayal had come purpose. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the conference table, a framed quote that one of the interns had placed there. It read, "Justice is not about revenge. It's about restoring balance." I smiled. They understood. That night, I returned home to the quiet. I lit a single candle and opened one of my old notebooks. The pages were filled with my handwriting, frantic at first, then measured, then calm. The record of a woman clawing her way through grief and fury toward understanding. I added one last entry. There was a time when I believed revenge was the only way to reclaim my life. But revenge is a circle. It always brings you back to where you started. What breaks the circle is forgiveness, not of others, but of yourself. I forgive the woman who stayed too long. I forgive the one who fought too hard. And I thank the one who finally learned to let go. I closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the same soft whisper it had carried the day I left the city behind. I thought about the years, the losses, the quiet triumphs that no one else would ever know. In the end, the revenge had never been about destruction. It had been about revelation, about seeing the truth for what it was and surviving it. I leaned back, watching the flicker of the candlelight fade. My life had begun with a man's betrayal, but it ended in my own freedom. And as the room settled into stillness, I realized that for the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking about power or justice or even legacy. I was simply at peace.